Welcome back to Ross Taylor Woodworks. I've got a tilt-top Queen Anne table. This is roughly circa 1780. It's very early, and it's a little bit unusual with some mixed woods in it. The top appears to be chestnut. The legs also appear to be chestnut, and the column appears to be cherry. Now let's take a closer look at what the problems are. The top has quite a bad split in the middle. This glue joint came apart. The beading on the outside edge is broken. And it's also got pretty good warp. Both pieces are cupped. There's some nails that were tapped in. And one serious problem is this stretcher is split right here. It's cracked. And it's got a pretty good split right down the middle of the column. And it was previously repaired around here. And one leg was previously repaired or reattached. There's a plug here. Now we'll look at the bottom. It has what's called a spider on the bottom. This is the original one. It's just a forged piece of metal that ties all the legs together. But on this leg that was previously repaired or reattached, this part of the spider is missing. And a metal strap was put in place here. Now this previous repair appears to be stable and nice and solid. I'm not going to do any repairs to this leg. I'm just going to leave this strap alone. Going to leave this the way it is. Now I may do something about the split here. I may glue in a sliver of wood in the split. But the bottom part here I'm just going to leave alone. It all seems to be stable and solid. Look at the bottom of the feet here. They're pretty well worn. Somebody had some felt on the bottom here. And pretty indicative of chestnut is these wormholes. Now I was unable to determine whether this is American or English. The customer that brought it indicated that it might be English. This may very well be an English chestnut. I do see a little bit of fleck in here. It does not appear to be oak. Alright, the first thing is to start taking it apart. I'm going to take the latch off. Now I want to get the screws out of the stretchers. I got one screw here that I can't get a bite on. So I'm going to try to clean out the groove in the screw. Still having trouble getting a bite. Now I'm going to use a file and try to file the groove. I was able to open it up a little bit. I still couldn't get a bite on it, so I resorted to the impact driver and put my weight behind it, and it quickly backed the screw right out. And now I've removed all those screws, and now I have to deal with those nails that were driven down through the top. I'm going to use a pry bar and trying to gently pry the stretcher loose. The nails were a modern wire nail. There's a couple more nails holding the end of the top together. Okay, now that I've got all those nails out, I'm ready to strip the finish. It's in very poor condition, and it was partly stripped before. The column had been partly stripped. So I'm just going to finish stripping it. Alright, I've got the rest of that finish stripped off. I got it all cleaned up. And I was just finishing up cleaning out these cracks. Using the oscillating saw to get in there and clean them out. And then a little bit of sandpaper. And we're probably gonna glue in some cherry here. Okay, clean these up as well. These are the stretchers. I'm gonna glue this back together. And both these stretchers are slightly curved. They're not gonna hold the top very flat. So what I'm thinking of doing is widening them a little bit, straightening out and widening it with a small piece, and just making the stretchers a little bit wider so that they're a little stronger and will hold the top flat. What that's going to mean is relocating the pivot hole downward slightly, so I'll have to plug this and move this downward. Okay, I've got this ready to glue up here. I'm going to use some epoxy to glue this together real quick. Cleaned it up. I cleaned everything out with a file. Got any old glue out. The top dry clamped. First cleaned up the edge with the cabinet scraper. And it mates up really well. And using a block here in the middle, I'm going to try to hold the entire seam flat and level. I'm going to go to glue it up. Now I'm going to deal with the stretchers. They're slightly out of square and slightly curved and not very straight. So I'm going to flatten it on the belt sander and make sure it's square before I glue the new strip on the bottom. Now I'm going to glue a new edge on the bottom. Okay, I took those stretchers out of the clamps. Now I want to get the new piece flush with the original stretcher. And just going to lightly sand it. And then just trim the edge off and then make everything flush. Now I'm going to trim them for width. I want to make them the same width as the pivot block, which is 1.5 inches, which is going to widen them by about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. Okay, the next step is to plug these holes. I've got to relocate the pivot hole here down to the bottom of the stretcher. And I've noticed that they're not quite in line. The stretchers must have been slightly out of alignment. I'm going to make sure these are lined up. Now there's one little piece that split off here. I'm just going to use some wood filler and fill that in. Okay, I've marked out the location for the new pivot hole, and I want it just inside the edge of the stretcher. Now I went and drilled the screw holes all the way through with the 1/4 inch drill bit. Now on the bottom side I'm going to take a 3/8 bit and drill in about 3/8 of an inch. This will allow the top to expand and contract. Alright, now before I install the stretchers, I want to color in the new wood to match the old. It'll be difficult to do once they're installed on the table. First start off with a little mahogany die. Then I wetted the top of the stretcher just to see what the color is. And I mixed up some colors and start matching the color. And last is just to touch up where the plugs are and the little spot that I filled in. Now I'm going to deal with that split in the column. I made some small cherry strips, and I'm going to do it in several small pieces. Now I'm going to use the oscillating saw and just trim off most of the excess. Now just using various files to get the strips down flush, and then follow up with some light sanding. Now I want to attach the stretchers. I looked through all my screws, and the only thing I could find was some 1 1/4" Phillips. They're just the right length. But the holes are going to be filled after I put the screws in, so you won't see the heads. I've got some tape here right along the line of where the stretcher should be. You can see the outline of the old where the stretcher was. And I also plugged the old screw holes. I've got the top set up with some clamps, just clamping it down a little bit, getting it flattened out so that these sit flat. So when I screw the stretchers in, and once it's fastened, it'll hold the top flat. Now that we've widened the stretchers, it'll be a little bit stiffer, and it'll help hold it flat. Okay, now I've got it set up with the pedestal in place, and setting up my stretchers along the tape here. And I've got another piece of tape here lining up the pedestal. Now I'm going to start on this first one. Pre-drill a little hole, poke a little hole to start. And make sure the stretcher is centered and it's lined up here. So we'll poke a little hole just to get the screw started. So I want to bite into the wood. Really get a real good bite into the wood. And the other side, just make sure it's lined up with the tape. Okay, finished putting the other screws in. And it swings nice and free. I'll take the top, release it from the clamps here. Flip it over. Closes nice and flat, swings nice and free. This turns out not to be a chestnut. I wasn't quite sure at first. Right in here it looks like chestnut. But that has this sort of quarter sawn looking grain right here. So it turns out to be red oak. Did a small cross section right here. What I do is take a sharp chisel and make a slicing cut and try to get a nice clean cross section of the grain. This is a book I've had for about 25 years, Identifying Wood, by R. Bruce HOADLEY from Taunton Press. Fantastic book. Okay, this is the section on ring porous hardwoods. This is chestnut. And these are the oaks over here. And you can see by that picture, it had these very strong lines running through. And the chestnut does not have those. That's very distinctive of chestnut. It does not have those strong lines or rays running through it. So it's definitely in the red or white oak. And white oak has these little like little soapy bubbles and these large pores. And I can see on the table that did not have those. So it was on the red oak. And the late wood pores looked very similar. They kind of run in these lines. And that looked almost identical to this. So it's definitely some sort of a red oak. Now maybe some subspecies of red oak. There's all sorts of different subspecies of red oak. Maybe an unusual species I haven't seen before. That's why it didn't quite look like oak on the surface grain. Okay, here's a sample of red oak. The oaks have these little dash lines, little rays in the surface of the wood, and the tabletop does not have these. That's what had me a little bit confused. It does not appear to have these little lines. And chestnut does not have these little lines. After I glued it together, I had a little bit of a cup right here. And those widened stretchers seem to be doing their job. It seems to be holding it nice and flat. Now the next thing is to replace the beading on the outside here. I went ahead and made the bead, just an 1/8 inch bead using a beading plane, and ripped it to width on the table saw. Now there's one other damaged piece on the edge there. I took that off. I'm also going to replace the ones on the ends that were missing. Okay, I cut the pieces to fit. Now I'm going to pre-drill and use some small finish nails. Okay, now I've got down in the finishing room. I went ahead and started finishing. I've gotten a couple coats of shellac on. Started coloring in the edges. I also tinted the top just a little bit with a little bit of red. Started touching up the crack. And I also tinted the legs a little bit with some red, just to bring them in line with the color of the column. Alright, then the next step is to fill these screw holes. What I'm going to use is a colored beeswax filler. I'm actually going to make that. I'm going to make a matching color. And the way I do that is to melt down a little bar of beeswax in a little tin can. Then start adding pigments to it. I want to go for kind of a dark oak color, since those stretchers are oak. And then just keep stirring it around until the beeswax solidifies. And then add a little bit of mineral oil to make it more workable. And once again, have to keep stirring until the beeswax solidifies, otherwise the pigments will settle out. This will solidify pretty quickly, and it'll be ready to use in maybe 15-20 minutes. Okay, while the wax is still warm and soft, I can easily mold it into the hole and use a small wooden stick to shape it into place. I'm also going to use the same filler to fill in a few small holes in the top. If you recall, there were some nails driven down through the top, and there's a few holes to fill in. Then some naphtha and steel wool to remove the excess wax. And the same thing on the stretcher. I can remove the excess wax and then kind of mold the wax into place. And finally, just a little touch-up to help blend it in. Okay, the table's all done. Let's take a look. Let's do a quick review. I remember this glue line came apart, glued that back together. There were some nails that were driven down through the top here. Those were some modern wire nails that weren't appropriate. Somebody had done a repair at some point. And the beading on the edge here was missing. Okay, here's where that split in the stretcher was. Stitch that back together. And then widen the stretchers, make them stiffer, and it helped to strengthen this split. I glued in some small strips of cherry, filed them smooth, sanded it, and did some touch-up, and it blended in nicely. Left the legs alone. One of them had been repaired. A plug was put in here, so I decided just to leave that alone. It was perfectly fine.